the average person, the Rubik's Cube is an impossible puzzle, a fun toy to play with and fidget with, or maybe a cool desk ornament. Majority of these people will come to the conclusion that the Rubik's Cube is impossible after playing with it for a few minutes. Every so often, you have the person who refuses to put it down until they can figure it out. Eventually, when they solve it, they'll leave it at that. But even further than this, there's the person who thinks, I want to do it faster. And 40 years later, this is what those people have achieved. This is the history of the Rubik's Cube world record. The cube would first become available to the public in 1980. This is well before the speedcubing we know today would take off, but a few particular people would be ahead of the curve. The most notable of these people would be Min Tai, participating in the 1982 championship in Budapest. This was the first official championship for the cube, with people participating from 19 different countries. Min Tai managed to get an astonishing time of 22.95, nearly 2 seconds ahead of all of the other competitors. This record is especially impressive considering the Rubik's brand cubes they had to use, but also, this would be the longest standing record of all time. Not because it was the best, but because speedcubing went dormant for over 20 years after this, leaving the title to Min Tai. Speedcubing had become somewhat of a lost art. People had heard nothing of it in decades. But in the late 90s, the world was beginning to change rapidly. The rise of the internet was happening, and niche communities for everything were forming. Eventually, speedcubing found its place on the internet, and slowly started growing once again. The rate of growth started picking up slowly, and finally, multiple key members of this community decided it was time for another championship. Cubing was back. This time, cubing was here to stay. The competition showed that the community had grown to new heights over this time period. This time, with 5 times as many competitors compared to 1982, as well as an additional 13 events compared to 1982's 1. The record was taken multiple times that day. Dan Knight was able to beat the record by nearly 6 seconds with a 16.71 single. Later that day though, Jess Bond would steal this record by only 0.2 seconds with a 16.53. Cubing was just beginning to gain its footing as a community, so 2003 came and went with only 2 competitions, and it appeared the world record holder Jess Bond had gone dormant. But this wouldn't matter, as 2004 would be a very eventful year for the world record. 2004 was the reign of Shotaro Makasumi. Shotaro would soon become a glimpse into the future for speedcubing. In the first half of 2004, Shotaro would break the world record, twice. Not only that, he brought it down by a huge 2 seconds each time. He brought Jess Bond's 16.53 down to 14.76, and then only months later he pushed his own record down to an impressive 12.11. The remaining 9 months of 2004 would see no record, and 2005 was even more uneventful. Though before the year ended, Gene Pons managed to barely edge out the record. He brought it down to an 11.75. Luckily, 2006 would be more eventful than 2005, with 2 records. The record traveled to America, where Leon Lowe and Toby Mao would push the record down to 10.48, with an 11.13 and a 10.48. And at this point, people realized it was possible to solve the Rubik's Cube in under 10 seconds. The race was on. By 2007, the community was exploding. The forum speedsolving.com had been opened a year prior. 2007 would be the biggest year for cubing yet, and it would show in the records too. Edward Chaman kicked off the year with our first record, inching out Toby's record by 0.1 with a 10.36, and at this point, it was just a race to get under 10 seconds. Thibaut Jacquinot achieved the first sub-10 less than halfway through the year. Unfortunately, there isn't any footage of this solve, but luckily the community didn't have to wait long to witness some more sub-10s. But before we get into that, we have to get into one of the biggest events in cubing history, Worlds 2007. Now this strays a little bit from the record, but I think it's pretty important. So 2007 was the biggest competition at the time. Everyone was placing their bets on who would win, and people opened threads to pull on who they thought it would be, and everyone was positive it would be someone with a top 10 average. The only question on people's minds was who. The thing was, none of the top 10 would win. In fact, only one just barely squeezed onto the podium. The winner was Yu Nakajima. Everyone was shocked. Yu had only ever attended one other competition where he placed third, and after this point, Yu would continue shocking the community, which we'll get into next year. After Worlds, Edward would join the sub 10 club with a time just 0.04 seconds behind the world record, and only days after that, a very important person we'll hear more of later named Erik Akertsjik would bring the record down to 9.77. Harris Chan would also squeeze in here with a 9.80, and Ron Van Bertram, one of the co-founders of the WCA, would break the record once more before the year ended, bringing it down to 9.55. 2008 would be almost as big a year as 2007. Only 2 months into the year, Edward finally got his record back with a 9.18, already bringing us close to sub 9. Everyone was wondering who would be the one to break this barrier, and 2 months later, at Kashiwa Open 2008, Yu Nakajima strikes again. He crushed the record with an amazing 8.72 single. This was nearly half a second ahead of anyone else at this time. But even though that's impressive, what's more impressive is he did this twice. He literally got an 8.72 single in the first round, and then tied that same exact world record time in the second. One might think this record would stand for a while, considering how far ahead it was, but only a couple months later, Eric did the unthinkable. He beat Yu's record. Not by half a second, not by a second, by almost 2 seconds. This is only 2 months after Yu's completely record-shattering 8.72. Eric achieved a 7.08. This was an unprecedented record. It was miles ahead of the competition. Unsurprisingly, the record would stand for the remainder of the year, as well as the entirety of the next year. This would be the first of what I'd call a super record, for lack of a better word. I'd define a super record as an outlier that breaks the common trend in records, and it usually has a profound impact on the community. There's only 3 records, maybe 4, I would consider, quote, super records. And if you look at this graph, you can pick them out pretty clearly. As you can see, there's clusters of dots or new records, and then sudden quick drops followed by long stretches of no record. So I've edited the graph a little bit, and I've drawn an exponential trend line so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about here. Most of the records fall on the line or maybe even a little above it. Then there's a few records that are below the line, and in Eric's case, it's way below the line. So I guess that's how I define a super record, or I don't know, it's basically just a record that was ahead of its time, just statistically speaking. Eric's record would stand for a grand total of 854 days. Slowly people inch closer to Eric's record, and by 2010, a man named Harris Chan was about 0.2 seconds behind Eric, and a little bit after that, a small person you might have heard of named Feliks Zemdegs had broken the world record average and was sitting a comfortable 0.1 seconds behind Harris Chan's single at 7.43. And just before the end of 2010, Feliks finally managed to snag the record from Eric with a 7.03, nearly sub 7, and by the end of that same day, Feliks had done it. He achieved an unheard of 6.77, but he wouldn't stop there. He would truly prove his dominance in 2011, where he broke his own record 5 times, pulling far ahead of everyone else. He brought his 6.77 down to 6.65, and then achieved another 6.65 months later, and at that same competition, he brought it down to 6.24. Feliks was going to get into the 5-second range single-handedly, but not before lowering it to 6.08, and then again, at the same competition, Absolutely smashing his own record, he achieved a 5.56 single. Feliks was like Shotaro, but on steroids. No one could come close to him. This record was similar to Eric's 7.08, and as time went on, Feliks began slowly taking every record in the N/N line. In 2011, he broke the 4x4 record twice, the 5x5 record 4 times, and he got the 6x6 record, which Kevin Hayes stole from him, but he quickly stole it back later on in the same year. And although he had no records for the 2x2 single, he held the 2x2 average at this whole time after breaking it twice in 2010. This kind of dominance is unprecedented in any skill-based activity like this. Feliks had proven himself to be the best cuber in the world. Slowly, Feliks's 5.56 inched towards the 854 day mark that Eric's record had stood for. Inevitably though, the competition began catching up to Feliks, and by April 2012, Michal, who had stolen the world championship from Feliks, was right behind him. And after that, Yumi Tabuchi took the second place spot. And finally, less than 2 weeks away from outlasting Eric's record, Mats Falk took the record from Feliks for the first time in 3 years. It seemed like Feliks was falling behind, as just prior to this, Mats had taken the 4x4 record as well. But this is far from the truth, as you may know. These two would end up having some of the best competition down the line, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves there. Alright guys, so that just about wraps up part 1, and if you're still watching this video, I just wanted to say thank you. This video was several months in the making, and I was really excited to get it out, so I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe, and that would also help notify you when part 2 comes out, hopefully in the next month. So again, thanks for watching.